Hello, everyone. Today is March 1st, 2022. Thank you all for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 3, Greenhouse Gas Accounting and Cost. Today, my name is Brenda Corona, and today from the Stakeholders Affairs Group for California, so we'll be facilitating today's meeting. And I'm also joined here by Kevin Head and Brian Jacobson from the California ISO. We will have a few meeting reminders on this slide right here for this meeting, and our goal is to make sure we are able to foster an open dialogue and sharing ideas and perspectives. Please make sure to raise your hand above the raise hand virtual icon to submit a question, and we will be able to answer it on there. After you've done asking your question and no further questions are being needed, please put your hand down in order for us to continue going along the list of our fellow attendees. Please start by stating your name and affiliation. That way we could be able to know who's speaking. And these meetings are recorded and video files will be posted on the initiative's website. As well, the recording and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And we will be able to pause for questions after each agenda item. And also the other presentation we have here today will have a different layout of having questions. So feel free to hear for that. And also feel free to provide any comments to all panelists, so that way we could be able to answer those questions on the side. But if you do have any technical issues, please let us know, send us a chat through the event producer, and we will be able to help. For today's meeting agenda here, we will have an introduction by Kevin Head, and then we will have a wonderful presentation from Jeff Spires and Mary Winkie from the public public generating pool, and they will have an unspecified zonal approach version 2.0, and they will have a Q&A question for all, and then Brian Jacobson will have a recap of discussion, hopefully around the 2:45 mark. So feel free to let us know any questions, and now I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Kevin Head for our wonderful introduction.
Thanks, Brenda. Welcome everybody to working group number 3. Looking forward to today's discussion. I've got today's objective on slide 4, and very similar to what we did last week. We will be doing an overview of the unspecified or zonal approach. You'll hear both terms being used here, referring to the same approach. And this is something that was raised, about a month and a half ago, and we've had a little bit more time to think through some of the different elements of it. And so hopefully that'll come through in today's presentation. I encourage folks to participate and ask questions where they might be unclear of anything, or keep in mind open questions in their mind. You'll see several points in the presentation where 2 different options are given. I encourage us to debate those today, but if we don't reach a conclusion on those, that's fine. I think we might take next Tuesday's presentation or next Tuesday's time to flesh out a little bit more of the details of it. There's a lot of material here today, as you'll see. So don't feel that we need to get a final answer on everything, but to the extent that we can close out certain scope items, that would be ideal, because I do want to be in a position going into not this Thursday, but next Thursday's meeting, where we can perform an evaluation of this approach alongside the one that we heard from the California ISO policy team on Thursday. So looking forward to this conversation today. The presentation is given by Jeff Spires and Mary Winkie. I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves. Most of you might be familiar with them already. So we'll take questions, as Brenda said. Please raise your hand, and we'll take certain pauses during the presentation, and that's when we'll start calling on folks. So raise your hand if you have a question. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeff and Mary. So please go ahead, guys. Good luck.
me? It looks like I'm muted. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. This is Mary Winke. I'm with the Public Generating Pool. I did want to clarify that, and I'm sure Jeff will clarify this himself, but he is with PowerX and not with the Public Generating Pool, just in case there was any confusion about that. So I just wanted to preface this before we get into this that, you know, the original presentation that we gave a few weeks ago now was something that had been developed, you know, in a prior time frame. It wasn't fully vetted, and I think the presentation itself was put together for kind of an internal group, and I think lacked a lot of kind of context and detail that would have been helpful for that discussion. So since that time, we've done a lot of work on providing that context and background and providing more ideas on this approach. And also, you know, talking to a lot of different folks and getting feedback and input. So I'm hoping that this will answer, to the extent possible, a lot of the questions that folks submitted to the CAISO in their homework, and we'll go a fair distance in advancing the ball on this zonal approach. So we can just go ahead and get started. Thank you. So again, I have a few slides here that are really introduction and background slides, probably redundant for many of you, but I think worth just going through because I think it sets the stage for kind of how we got to where we got to. So I'll try to go through these initial slides quickly. What I'd like to do will have some kind of natural pauses in the presentation, and we'll ask for questions at that time, rather than stopping as soon as questions come in. So feel free to raise your hand at any time, but just know that we'll kind of have a few moments of pause to answer questions as we go through this. So as I mentioned, the zonal approach was initially conceived in the 2019-2020 timeframe based on a group of EIM entities working together to consider approaches for Edam that were different from the approach in the EIM. And the thinking at the time was to replace the current EIM framework and apply this zonal concept in both EIM and Edam. But then when the Edam stakeholder process was paused, this concept was really put on hold, and the group that initially conceived it never really fully vetted it into a final proposal. So I would still characterize this as conceptual, even though we've worked, there's been a significant amount of work on fleshing it out. I would still characterize this as conceptual, and this presentation is really, doesn't reflect the positions of any one entity or group. It's just really trying to think about things in a little different way and present this alternative concept. But like I say, the sort of group of EIM entities that initially was working on putting together doesn't have the same format to be working on this proposal, so it no longer represents kind of those entities. So go ahead to the next slide. So again, just wanted to kind of set the stage on the basic policy framework that many of you are familiar with. Both California and Washington will have regulations on emissions associated with imported energy beginning in 2023. California obviously in place already. Both programs are based on a first jurisdictional deliverer point of regulation, such that the entity who is identified as the importer is the entity that has a compliance obligation and needs to report those emissions, and those requirements are enforceable by the Air Resources Board in California or by the Department of Ecology in Washington on that importer. Megawatt hours and emissions associated with imports are reported. So this means emission, non-emitting and emitting imports are reported. And then importers with a compliance obligation purchase and retire allowances. Okay, go to the next slide. Everybody should be pretty familiar with that already. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah, there we go. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time also characterizing the policy framework as it applies in the bilateral market and currently in the EIM. And partly why I wanted to set the stage this way is to be able to put the zonal unspecified approach in the context of existing frameworks. You know, I think as we've thought more about this concept and worked on it, that we really think that for the most part, with specific identified areas, the zonal approach is really consistent with existing precedents and existing approaches, and it's not something that is completely, you know, far afield from existing practices. So in talking about the bilateral market, energy is treated as unspecified as a default unless imports are permitted or required to be claimed as the source of electricity delivered. So for a specified source, you have to have some criteria that are met to establish that as a specified source report, typically a contract or an E-tag. The emissions rate for the specified sources are resource specific, and the default emission rate is applied to unspecified imports where the resource of that, where that energy is coming from, is not known or cannot be known. Asset controlling supplier imports are at a system annual average rate, but similar criteria apply. And then oh, please go back. Didn't quite go there yet. And then the electricity importer is identified as the purchase selling entity on the E-tag. So then that is the mechanism for figuring out who has the responsibility under the applicable regulations. And I want to just also clarify here, the rules in Washington are currently being developed. They largely mirror California so far, but many of them aren't final. So there's a lot of references in here to just California, but I think what we assume is that ultimately the same kinds of rules apply in Washington, even though many of them are not finalized yet. And then I think a key aspect, too, is that market participants have control over whether energy is imported into California and are able to price energy accordingly with the obligation to purchase allowances. In the EIM, it's the EIM Participating Resource Scheduling Coordinator. That is the importer. And as we've talked about quite a bit, the CAISO uses bid adders to attribute resources and quantities supporting EIM transfers, and then compensates those participating resources for their cost of compliance. A key difference, all the emissions rates in the EIM approach are resource specific. There's no default unspecified factor applied. And then participating resource may specify quantities that are available, but do not ultimately control when and how energy is attributed to CAISO demand. So, or like you say, or potentially Washington load. So you may have entities across the footprint having energy attributed to either Washington or CAISO. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. Okay, so just want to talk a little bit about some of the thinking around why a different approach was needed for the EIM. And you know, the bilateral, and what I'm talking about actually is not, I'm going way back to when EIM was first put in place. I'm talking about the kind of 2014, 2015 timeframe where PacifiCorp was joining the EIM, and there was a different approach developed for EIM, which ultimately resulted in what's in place today. So I'm not talking about sort of moving forward with Edam. So there was originally a different approach was needed for the EIM, because in the EIM there's a centralized market and no bilateral transaction. So the entity that is the PSE on the E-tag for EIM is not necessarily the owner of the energy being imported. Essentially, that energy is coming from the entire market footprint. So it didn't seem appropriate to assign the entity on the E-tag in the same way that you would in a bilateral market as the entity with the compliance obligation. Also, with bilateral transactions or source-specific tagging, there is a method to determine the source of energy, but with the EIM, there was not that similar method, but there was still solution needed to allow for those source-specific pathways and to identify the electricity importer and quantify those emissions. Okay, go to the next slide. So I just talked a little bit about why the different approach was adopted in Edam, and then now we're getting into kind of the 2019-2020 timeframe on why the EIM entities initially sought a new solution for Edam. I think there was concern, and I've raised this a number of times in this context, but concern with solutions that require the market operator to play this role of assigning specific resources to specific loads on a very granular basis. There was concern regarding market participant lack of control over whether and how energy is deemed delivered. Many states, or in particular Washington, raising double counting concerns associated with energy delivered to California, reported to California as non-emitting. There was a concern that, compliance planning in those states, compliance for meeting the policies in those states, in external states, not California, will be challenging if entities cannot plan for ahead of time or forecast or predict the amount of quantities that were deemed delivered. There was also really wanting to look across solutions that were more flexible, or that were at least considered to be potentially more flexible at the time in terms of accommodating more different types of policies or multiple jurisdictions adopting similar policies. And then also some concern that the EIM approach of attributing resources was not accurate, and so you weren't getting kind of the policy objectives achieved from an environmental perspective, or kind of the efficient market outcomes. Next slide, please. Okay. So that kind of does it for the history and the context. I appreciate you all bearing with me on that. I know a lot of it was probably repetitive, but we felt kind of worth setting the stage a little bit on this. Any questions on what I've gone through so far?
Hey, Mary. Yeah, just a reminder, everybody, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. I see that Vijay has his hand up, so I'll give Vijay a chance to hop in here. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself first, Vijay.
Yes, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Vijay with WRA. Thanks, Mary, for this effort, you and Jeff. I know there's more to come. I would like to clarify or better understand what you are meaning by, maybe you already did in the last slide, but ensuring source-specific pathway for imports. Can you expand on what you mean by that, please? Thank you.
Sure. Can we go back one slide maybe to get to that bullet there? Yeah. So I think the thinking was, in the absence of an E-tag or a evidence of a bilateral transaction from a particular resource, that there wasn't a way to identify, where the energy was coming from. And in the bilateral market, when the source of the energy is unknown, there's a default emission factor applied. But I think it was really seen as a problematic solution to apply some kind of default emission factor to all imports from the EIM. And we'll actually get into this a little bit further in the presentation, but you're not sort of enabling policy preferences for not emitting resources or considering the price for carbon associated with those imports. So it was, I think there was really a desire or need to have that kind of the ability to enable a sort of specific pathway for imports.
Okay, that helps a lot. So my real quick follow-up question, please, and then I'll keep quiet, is have we come to Jesus or agreed on, not trying to be religious, to not consider ETAG across the entire Edam footprint? Is the use of ETAG for an Edam footprint ruled out? Because California already uses it. So do you see any big concerns with, I don't want to get down a rabbit hole, but why not just build on that instrument that exists right now? Would that be creating more work?
So Vijay, I'm gonna set that aside for now.
Sure. No worries.
What I will say, just in the context of the kind of thought process at the time, was
Sure.
that using the ETAG to identify the importer was problematic for the reasons I just described. Whether or not there's a role for ETAGs in a future solution, I don't have an opinion on.
I get that, but thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Vijay. Let me check. Do we have any other hands up? Okay, I see George Angelides. George, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and please introduce yourself first.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. This is George Angelides with the California ISO. I just want to clarify one thing. It was mentioned that bilateral contracts are not present in EIM, and I want to correct that. We do have bilateral contracts and support for it in EIM, and they're captured in the base schedules for base transfers. And also in the base schedules from resources, they do represent day-ahead arrangements, plus any kind of bilateral contracts. They're in there. We do support that. And can I have a look at slide 6? I think I saw something there that I may have a comment. So there's the second bullet. It says concern regarding market participant lack of control in participating in the greenhouse gas regulation. But this is this meant to be as a problem for an approach that has a hurdle rate, the zonal approach that you basically don't have as an external resource the control to participate or not to the program? I'm not sure I understand that. If you could clarify, Mary.
Sure, and I think we'll get into more to what's involved in the zonal approach in a few minutes.
Okay.
So I don't want to directly address that yet, and maybe we'll kind of revisit your question as we get there. What I will just say is that this concern is really stemming from the conclusion in Washington and potentially other states, but Washington is the farthest down the road of finalizing this in rule, that if energy is reported as zero emitting to California, the REC associated with that energy is not eligible for compliance with Washington's clean energy policy. And I think, first of all, I do feel like that, that rule broadly applied is problematic because you are potentially problematic from a market perspective, because you have states, like, you could also think of the example, like if under a deeming approach, you now have potentially California renewable energy being deemed delivered to Washington, but presumably the RECs are still staying in California. And, how are these accounting issues sort of resolved and across state lines? And I think the concern for an entity in Washington, if it can't know in advance, what energy is going to be reported to California as zero emitting, it can't know what RECs it's going to have to plan for compliance. And so I think that's really what this bullet is trying to get at, that entities who are subject to those policies have to be able to plan for how they're going to comply, and if they don't have any, predictability or sense of what quantities are going to be reported to California, I think it creates a real concern in terms of ensuring that they're going to be able to meet those state compliance obligations. I recognize that there are ways to kind of flag resources and identify quantities in the kind of deemed approach, but I think optimally we want a solution that really enables entities to be able to direct where their resources are going from an accounting perspective.
Yeah, I understand, but this is what the greenhouse gas beta adder does. It really gives you the ability to participate or not by how much you want to participate. So you are full control. So when I saw this comment, I thought I should inquire. But thanks. I appreciate it.
And yeah, I really am. I'm again sort of in the interest of kind of evaluating these approaches. I think that's a really key thing to understand. So I don't want to. And also partly this is just an explanation of why the EM entities sort of initially were thinking about different solutions too.
Thank you.
Mary, it's Jeff. Can I just add to that?
Of course.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX. I think just to add to, Mary, what you were saying there, I think the other consideration there is we are seeing a growing number of jurisdictions looking at clean energy policies and renewable targets. That increases the number of objectives that various participants may be trying to meet. Those policies may be different from one another. I think ideally we would like to see harmonization where possible, but I think it does lead back to the question of, is it practical or feasible to have the market operator through the dispatch trying to assign resources to loads in different areas when there is a growing number of these different objectives that may be somewhat in conflict with one another, and it gets challenging for a resource or a participant to be able to ensure that their resource is being used the way that they intended. So, I just wanted to add, I think that's another consideration as we shift from EIM and the relatively small application of the deeming approach that's in place today to evaluating a day-ahead market in the context of expanding regional state policies.
I agree. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, can we keep going here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. So key objectives for the EDAM solution. These are really simplified objectives, but I think consistent with the kind of initial set of objectives that this group has discussed, but just kind of simplified here for these purposes, and maybe not quite completely aligned, but I don't think there's any departures here. But quantifying emissions associated with imports to CAISO in Washington. And this is really key, ensuring a source-specific pathway for imports into CAISO in Washington. So again, enabling a way for external resources to be considered specified imports. Enabling pricing and dispatch that reflects state pricing policies, and application of those costs to importers, minimizing leakage, and again, this is just the conversation that we were having, enabling participants to control decision-making about those imports kind of beyond that flagging eligibility toggle. Okay, next slide. So there was also, I think, some ways in which that we've concluded that the deeming approach doesn't fully meet those objectives, and we've talked about this quite a bit. But that you have some accuracy challenges with the deeming approach in terms of the deemed resource not being the one that actually increases its production, and that the deemed resource, it may not be deliverable to the GHG zone or capable of serving load within the GHG zone. And this drives pricing and dispatch inconsistent with state policies. And then also, like we were just talking about, the deeming is determined by an algorithm that may not be consistent with the participant's intended use of its resources. Next slide. Okay. So this slide should look familiar. This is the one slide I think that we kept in this slide deck from our prior presentation. So hopefully just a little bit of going back now to kind of where we started a few weeks ago and fleshing out some of the details. So again, the basic concept of the zonal approach, the GHG zone, non-GHG zone. The GHG zone resources are dispatched with a greenhouse gas cost. Resources in the non-GHG zone dispatched without a greenhouse gas cost. And just as a starting point, the zones are defined based on loads and resources physically located in a jurisdiction that has adopted a pricing policy. So for our purposes, you know, today the GHG zone is loads and resources physically located in Washington and California. And we'll talk a little bit more about whether or not there are separate GHG zones for each state. We'll get into that. But for now, just the basic concept is two zones. Okay, and I think this is where, oh no, I'm doing the slide and then I'll pass it on to Jeff here. So a key challenge with, just like I said, the basic approach of just defining the GHG zone based on physical location of loads and resources presents a key challenge, which many of you have raised, associated with imports from the non-GHG zone into the GHG zone. Assuming all imports are unspecified or emitting potentially introduces discriminatory treatment of similarly situated resources. In addition, we talked a little bit this already, but failing to enable that source-specific pathway, reduces the efficacy of those policy-driven changes in dispatch and investment signals, potentially disincentivizes out-of-state development of non-emitting resources, and then also reduces accuracy of the quantification of imports. So I think a really key piece of this is that for it to work, the zonal approach has to support some non-discriminatory access for non-emitting and ACS resources to the GHG zone. So I'm going to stop there. I think Jeff, maybe we should keep you going for a little bit before we ask questions, but I will let you make that decision, and Jeff is going to go through the next few slides.
Hey, Mary.
Yeah?
This is Kevin. I don't have an intuitive understanding of what is meant by an asset controlling supplier. What does that mean, or can you tell me how you understand that term?
Sure. So the way I'm thinking about this is sales, like system sales. So if you have an entity like BPA, who has an annual average emissions rate that's quite a bit lower than the default rate. Under ARB regulations, they have the ability to basically make system sales at that emissions rate, as opposed to, tagging back to a single resource. So I think what we're saying is that the zonal approach has to enable continuation of that policy of enabling those ACS resources to sell at that ACS emissions rate. And there's a process with ARB to, enable those sales. And I think I'm not that familiar with it, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but there's a process for obtaining that treatment.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So it's sort of a pool of resources, sort of like a system resource that's you would
Yeah.
look at the average emissions over a number of resources over a particular time period, and that would characterize the imports. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry, I'll let Jeff go. I just wanted
Okay.
that term defined. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Mary. I'll keep moving at least for a few slides, and then I think there'll be a natural time to stop and take any further questions. Maybe before moving any forward in terms of the details, I'll just reiterate what Mary was saying up front, which is, what we really wanted to do here is describe a concept and an approach that would need to be worked through in more detail. And so in some cases, we've put out some ideas here. In others, we've put out a couple of options. But I think the high level objective we had at this stage was to try to explain at a conceptual level what this might look like and what the key pieces of it would be. But certainly, as Mary mentioned before, we would need to refine a lot of the details and decide how each element would work in practice. But hopefully this is at least useful from the perspective of setting up the approach at a high level. Okay, so the first thing is thinking about possible pathways to enabling a source-specific treatment within the GHG zone. And as Mary mentioned, our starting assumption is that you have 2 or more GHG jurisdictions that apply GHG pricing to the resources in that area, and then you have some part of the external market footprint that does not have GHG pricing applied. And how do we enable those resources externally to be able to be treated on a source-specific basis within the GHG zone for the reasons Mary was mentioning? And 2 potential pathways that we had identified. Number 1 is by actually defining the GHG zone to include resources outside of those physical state boundaries in which the GHG policies apply. And so this would be applying some criteria other than merely where the resource is located to allow for external resources to be included in the zone. And there could be criteria that have similarities to the bilateral markets associated with contracts, et cetera. But structurally, what that most likely would look like is a longer term commitment for an entity or a resource that has a commitment to meet load within that GHG zone. And we say that because the assumption is that defining the GHG zone itself is not something that we would be expecting to be doing on an ongoing basis, but there would be some more static determination of which resources are included in that zone. And then once that occurs, from an optimization point of view, those resources would basically function as if they were located within the state boundaries. So from a dispatch and pricing point of view, they're inside the zone, essentially. And so that I believe is consistent with the thinking under any GHG approach, which is that the boundaries of the zone would be flexible and could be configured through the market. So that's path 1. Path 2 is that once that GHG zone has been defined, some imports from the external area into that zone could be treated on a specified source or an entity-specific basis in a way that's conceptually similar to specified source imports that occur today in the bilateral markets delivered into California. And this path is something that is also likely to be a part of a workable solution, because rather than only enabling a more long-term update to the GHG zone, this path would be applicable in circumstances where you may have a resource or an entity that has surplus clean or non-emitting supply that they would be able to transact, but they may have that in some periods and not others. Mary mentioned the ACS example as one of those situations in which there could be an entity outside of the region that has registered as an ACS and is seeking to participate in that form. There could be other hydro-based systems that have resources and load obligations outside of the GHG area, so they're not capable of necessarily joining the GHG zone permanently, but they would have surplus at least in certain periods. And I think there are other examples: solar oversupply, some IPPs, et cetera. So that is another pathway that we had contemplated, and both these approaches or some combinations seem viable, but of course, as we would work through the details, we'd need to have additional discussion and consideration about what these different approaches might look like. I see a question that maybe I'll just address before we move on, which is, what do I mean by a longer term commitment for entities that are committed to meeting load with the zone? That's just to say that if largely what I mentioned before, if the path to participating in the zone for a resource that's physically external, if that entity is seeking to, in effect, be brought into the GHG zone for the foreseeable future, that would be something that would probably go along with some longer term contract or something that would justify doing that, because like I mentioned before, we wouldn't anticipate that the GHG zone itself would be changing day to day. So that first pathway seems to contemplate a longer term commitment, as opposed to path 2, which is contemplating more like in the bilateral market paradigm, in which you have hourly potential schedules with an E-tag and a specified source treatment on a shorter term basis that would be appropriate for some of the other circumstances I was mentioning before. So we see both of those pathways as being worth considering based on the circumstances.
Thanks, Jeff. Hey, this is Kevin, really quick. So I think that this slide and the ideas that go along with it is something that we will want to put more specificity around. We don't need to do it today, but I would like to do it on Tuesday when we come back, because some of these terms, I think, to Kristen's point, who had raised that question about longer term commitments, I think are good conceptually, but if we want to have this to be in a place that we can take it into a straw proposal, we'll want to put some boundaries around these, and then also decide as a group whether we want one approach or the other, or a combination of the two, and then define certain things, like if I'm a resource that's been defined in a greenhouse gas zone but might be physically located outside of that state jurisdictional boundary, am I allowed to serve load outside of that zone, or will I ever be considered to do so? So I just want to flag this to the group as being something that we will return to when we come back in a more specific, targeted way. So thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate that, and I think certainly adding more specificity and detail where possible is valuable. The one point I would also note is, I think that the states and the policies that are developed also play an important role in terms of defining maybe what the criteria would be and how a resource may be treated, which is kind of the discussion in the following slide. So maybe if we move forward, that will help with that. So, as an example,
Jeff,
yeah.
Jeff, this is Mary. Can I just make one comment on the prior slide before we move on?
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Sure, thank you. So we initially in the proposal that we presented a couple weeks ago had also a concept in here about redefining the GHG zone to include load outside of the physical state boundaries, and we took that out of this presentation because I think there's a lot of additional complication there. And that's kind of what we sort of think of as like a phase 2 potential to actually redefine load in the GHG zone. But I did want to flag that I do think that this approach does have that sort of future flexibility and future discussion. So that's kind of where we landed on that. Not to completely set it aside, but it's not addressed in here as kind of a day one solution.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, next slide, please. So the other important topic that goes along with establishing the means to participate on a source-specific basis would be determining what the appropriate validation or criteria is to allow for that. And this is certainly an area that we would require further discussion amongst stakeholders and policymakers to really try to determine what's appropriate. But just as some potential elements for consideration, some of the ideas that we have discussed in the past include confirming that the participant is intending for that resource output to be imported to meet load in the GHG zone, either through a contract or some other means. I think this really ties back to some of the discussion we were having earlier and some of the issues that Mary was raising around the role of the market operator as opposed to the participant being able to decide how the resource is being used at a particular point in time. Another category is criteria to demonstrate the resource is committed or capable of meeting load in the GHG zone. For an example of the considerations under that category, one of PowerX's concerns is deliverability, and that the deeming algorithm as it's currently formulated doesn't have an assessment of whether the resources that are being deemed are actually deliverable to the GHG zone. So that's a consideration. From a leakage point of view and from an accuracy point of view, establishing criteria to reasonably validate that an entity that is delivering clean energy is actually has a clean surplus. This one is, I think, a challenge, and we would have to think through what those criteria might look like. And some of them might be met by some of the other bullets here too. For example, number 4, demonstration of other requirements associated with the applicable GHG program. There are existing approaches in place today associated with meter data, having a specified source contract. So I think ultimately we would need to develop what is the appropriate combination of elements. It might include some upfront validation, potentially some after the fact, or some combination of both. And we would have to be able to evaluate those various elements and determine whether on the whole they are providing the confidence and the comfort that a reasonable set of criteria has been met to justify the approach for that resource. So like I say, I think these are not these are illustrative at this point, and I think, for example, earlier, Vijay had asked the question about e-tags, and do e-tags play a role in the Edam or in validating GHG deliveries in some fashion? And I think that question and that discussion would fit well here in terms of thinking through what different approaches could be used to validate or provide criteria for source-specific treatment. So I will stop there and see if there are any questions, because I think this is a natural turning point to a new subject after this.
Okay, thanks. Really quick, so this would apply to not only emitting or clean resources, but also emitting resources that they could opt in to being in the GHG zone. Is that right? Through one of these two paths. It's not just for clean resources, not emitting.
I think that's probably true, and I think Mary probably has a better handle on some of the policy requirements, but my understanding is that there is situations in which, it's not necessarily only non-emitting or low-emitting resources that might be treated on a resource-specific basis or a source-specific basis, that other resources that meet certain criteria may also be treated that way. And so I think this could be viewed that way and more generically than only applicable to lower emitting resources. Mm-hmm. Maybe Mary, if you don't mind chiming in on that to make sure I've got that right.
Yeah, and I think the way that I definitely think there's more conversation needed on this overall, and this is one of those questions that needs conversation. But when I think about frameworks in the bilateral market, if the source of a resource, if the source of an import is known, it has to be reported as specified. And so I think there is an analog here in terms of the treatment of both emitting and non-emitting resources relative to that bilateral approach. But then I think there's also important differences as well. As you mentioned, Kevin, what if an entity is also selling, is exporting out of the GHG zone, or is attempting to make its resource available to the non-GHG zone? How do we kind of consider that scenario as well? So I think there's a lot of further conversation there, but like I say, I think the starting point, at least for me, is kind of within the existing regulatory framework.
Okay, thanks. So I'm seeing some hands go up. I'll go to Todd Jones first, who hasn't had a chance to ask a question, and then I'll come back to Vijay and George. So Todd, would you go ahead and ask your question, please? Todd, we're not hearing you. You might be muted on.
Todd, I think you're double muted. You need to unmute your device as well.
Thanks, Michelle. Todd,
I think Todd is having a couple of. Are you there, Todd?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right. Thank you. Sorry for the trouble. This is Todd Jones from Center for Resource Solutions. Maybe bear with me for just a moment, but so I'm trying to think through these two different approaches that you laid out to the source specific or the pathways for clean generators outside the zone to be treated on a source specific basis. So if one of the merits of this approach, the zonal or unspecified approach, is that it either wholly or in part sort of mitigates this concern from states like Washington and potentially others that GHG attribution resulting from optimization for GHG costs in the Edam affects the eligibility of RECs associated with attributed generation in their programs, then, this pathway for clean generators outside the zone to be treated on a source-specific basis seems sort of critical. And specifically, the first approach, by considering resources to be included in the zone and then treating those resources as in-zone generators, not subject to the hurdle. So not a resource-specific delivery to the zone, but sort of a source-based generation within the zone, seems to me to sort of avoid reporting of what's delivered to zonal load in the market, and therefore avoid any potential conflict with RECs as a different instrument or mechanism to attribute generation to load. Even then, there's sort of a question in my mind as to whether California is still sort of treating that as a delivery to California load based on its regulations, but it still seems different from the second approach, which I understand as resource-specific attribution to GHG zone load on a generator-specific basis, which would not necessarily mitigate the sort of double counting or REC eligibility concern, and in our view would still sort of require the same reporting to Regis for generation registered in Regis that is outside the zone and attributed to zonal load on a resource specific basis. So my question is, do you see a difference between the two in terms of the effect on RECs?
Jeff, do you want to answer that? I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Go ahead.
I'll take a crack at it.
Sure.
So this does not solve the issue of how to reconcile different accounting regimes across states or even within states. It doesn't solve that problem. What I do think it does is make it a little more manageable in terms of what we were talking about before, entities being able to plan for what they're going to be able to use for their own compliance and what might be directed to the GHG zone on a non-emitting basis. So I don't think it solves it, but I think it makes it more manageable. I will say I do think that you probably, if you're really thinking about scenarios in which entities, states and entities that adopt these kinds of policies aren't going to want to see their non-emitting energy reported anywhere if they really need those RECs for compliance. So I do think there's a broader, if the Washington rule is really applied across the whole region, I think you do create a lot of issues. And this doesn't solve that.
Thanks, Todd. I hope that answers your question. So this is just me thinking out loud. So what is the difference between path 2 and a situation where someone just sells their energy bilaterally through, like, into a greenhouse gas zone? What is the advantage of using path 2 in that context? I mean, isn't the ability to just bilaterally transact energy between a generating resource and a load already existing? Like, what does this model do that's different?
Yeah, I think in many ways there's a lot of similarities, which it establishes an approach for doing that, but then trying to incorporate that into Edam so that rather than it only taking place bilaterally, it could still be part of the EIM, or I should say Edam market dispatch, and there could still be the optimization benefits of that. but leveraging some of those elements that already exist today in terms of defining an approach that supports source-specific deliveries to a GHG zone.
Okay. I will go to the next hand up, which was Vijay. Vijay, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Jeff and Mary, thank you for this. You've clearly put some thought into this. I have two questions. First is big picture policy question. Second is a little technical nuance. Policy question, Jeff and Mary, I realize we have one state now, other than California, proposing a clear intent to price carbon, and so you are coming up with this thought process. And I do like the thought around the imported resources and how to be non-discriminatory. Do you see any risk of this approach with just Washington in mind? And if we have a patchwork of other states coming up with different things later, do you, in other words, are we straitjacketing a solution here that will restrict changes of flexibility later? Is my first policy question. And my second is a related question is, Jeff, you made a very strong pitch 4 weeks ago on the challenges with the EIM framework for GHG and the deemed and delivered and all that. Will this approach be an improvement to that and address your own criticism of the EIM approach? Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. I'll take the first shot at answering those questions, and then if Mary wants to add, please do. I don't think that this proposal is specific to California or to Washington. I think as we move through the rest of the slides, we have some discussion around flexibility and how this would fit with more than one jurisdiction that's applying GHG pricing. I think this approach has a significant amount of flexibility because it's relatively simple to start with. But I think we should come back to some of that as we get towards the end of the slides when we raise that more specifically. As to the challenges that I had raised a few weeks ago with the EIM deeming, I do think that this approach addresses many of those issues, and I think we'll get into why that's the case in the next few slides, which are focused on the application of the hurdle rate and the means to address leakage concerns that I think will help illustrate why that is. But I'll turn it over to Mary just to see if she has anything to add on that. On either of those.
Just on that first question, Jeff, I disagree that I think we can't know whether or not we're putting something in place that's going to hamstring the future. You know, there's a possibility that that is the case, but I think we like this approach and we think it is flexible enough to be accommodative of new state programs.
Right. Thanks, Vijay, for the questions. I recognize that we need to keep moving. I just want to give George one chance to ask a question, and then considering the time, I think we should keep moving through the slides after that. So folks, thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Kevin. This is George Angelidis with the ISO. Maybe a clarifying question, Jeff and Mary. I am trying to understand why is it so significant to have this notion of a contractual arrangement for external resources to serve load in a greenhouse gas regulation area for the foreseeable future. I find that very limiting. A participant may want to participate in the program 1 hour, may not want to participate in the next hour. or they may only want to participate for a certain number of megawatts that could be different from 1 hour to the next. Why would we force them into some contract that will take away all the flexibility from them in participating in this program? So I need to understand this. This is very unclear to me. If you could comment. Thank you.
George, I think that the questions you're raising really relate back to why we see the two different paths as being necessary to consider under a proposal like this, because I think that that's ultimately what those two paths lead to, where there's one that's more of a longer term determination associated with a potentially a longer term contract or other elements of that, but it's a decision that's being made to define the GHG zone in a certain fashion. And then the other pathway, I think, largely speaks to exactly what you're getting at, which is resources that have surplus that they would like to be able to sell into the GHG zone, and how do we do that and enable that? So I think that's what that second path was attempting to achieve. And that's, as an example, in the bilateral market, that's what is possible, but it still has certain criteria, even if it's an hourly transaction, associated with demonstrating that delivery through the E-tag, through a specified source contract for the resource, et cetera. So I think that these elements actually do apply even on a shorter term basis, or could apply on a shorter term basis. But I think the broader response is that we are contemplating ways to enable that type of activity that you're describing.
And specifically for the ISO, as such a contract, would it be perceived or thought of as a resource adequacy contract, since that external resource really signs a contract to serve ISO load?
I don't think that it is relevant whether it's resource adequacy or not. I think the requirements associated with treatment of specified source is related to whether you have the contract for that resource and you have the E-tag and meter data to support that. And that can occur in any time frame, shorter term or longer term contract.
Okay, I'll hold my other questions for you to explain first how you're going to handle the path 2 then, because I think it becomes relevant now.
Yeah, thanks, George. Good questions. And maybe as we're preparing to chew through some more of these details in a subsequent meeting, just I'd encourage folks to think about, their willingness to commit their resources into these contracts, and how quickly they can come in and out of this path 1, and the extent to which they have to commit their whole resource into this, or whether it can just be a portion of the output of the resource. So let's move on, but just in thinking about a future meeting, please consider these. It'd be nice to get more folks from the generation side to weigh in. So thanks, George. Jeff, back to you.
Okay, so we are going to move on. I think just to the last discussion with Vijay and Mary, I think Mary made a fair point that, we certainly can't tell the future and how all the different policies will develop. But I think, what we're trying to do here is lay a concept out that could be compatible with at least what we're contemplating at this point in time, and what we think has enough elements of flexibility that, it would be something that could adapt, hopefully, to how things evolve. But, certainly that's not something we can be definitive about at this point. So just shifting gears a little bit now to talk about leakage as one of the criteria in which we're evaluating any GHG proposal. And maybe just to start with a little bit of a brief introduction of what we mean by leakage. I think the first thing to recognize is that a regional market optimization is inherently seeking to transfer the most economic energy across subregions within the market footprint. And that's just fundamental to the organized market dispatch. And where that's, of course, challenging is when that market footprint includes some subregion that is applying GHG pricing and another subregion that's not. And leakage is created when energy transfers occur between those two areas, and as the result of not considering GHG costs or not considering them accurately enough, you can result in a shift in emitting generation from the GHG zone to the non-GHG zone. And that is sort of the classic definition of leakage. The other form that raises some, or that is often discussed, is secondary dispatch, which is where a non-emitting resource outside of the GHG zone is identified as being imported into the GHG zone, while another emitting resource is increasing its production, to, in essence, backfilling to meet load outside of the area. So that is a little bit different from the traditional definition of leakage, but it's another form of a similar challenge that we're seeking to contemplate through the GHG solution. Next slide, please. And so ultimately, the zonal approach, as it's developed, should consider how these two different variations of leakage are addressed, and the objective being to try to minimize the displacement of resources across the subregions as a result of leakage outcomes. And I think what we wanted to start with is saying that the first step is to define appropriate criteria to support a resource either being included in the zone or being treated as a specified import. And that's much like we were already talking about, confirming that the participant has met whatever the validation criteria is. And what that does is it creates a starting point for resources that have been established to be committed to serving load in the GHG zone. So really what we're saying there is just that first step is trying to define that criteria well and making sure that the steps we're taking to enable clean access to the zone are supported by a reasonable set of requirements that justify doing it treating those resources in that way. But of course, what that leads to is what is the approach for the remaining resources. And this is actually where we sort of started the presentation last time. And I think today what we wanted to do was start with the discussion we've just been having, which has been focused on enabling clean resources to participate. But now we're moving away from that. If we move forward to the next slide, please. And now we're talking about resources that are or imports that are occurring through the market that don't meet those criteria. And so the concept there is that all imports into the GHG zone that don't meet the established criteria for a source-specific treatment would face an unspecified hurdle rate, with the goal being of minimizing the inefficient dispatch and unaccounted for increases in GHG emissions associated with those imports. what the hurdle rate will do is it would add an assumed GHG cost based on an estimate of the emissions intensity of an assumed marginal resource, and it would apply that to those imports that aren't either included in the zone or treated as resource specific, which I already mentioned. While this wouldn't prevent all leakage, as I don't think a perfect solution is achievable, having an unspecified hurdle rate would greatly reduce the risk of an emitting resource that's outside of the zone inefficiently displacing a similar resource in the zone. And this concept of applying an unspecified hurdle rate to imports is similar to the approach in the bilateral markets in which, absent meeting those criteria for specified source treatment, imports are assumed to be at the marginal emissions rate for the unspecified emissions rate, I should say. Apologies. So just to lay out a quick mathematical example, just to help illustrate what the concern is and how this would help address it. Imagine you have two resources. So if just looking at the graphic, in the GHG zone, you have resource A. Its energy cost is $30. Its GHG cost is $10. So from a total cost perspective, it's $40. In the non-GHG area, imagine you have resource B. Its underlying energy cost is $35. If it were to be treated on a resource-specific basis, its GHG cost is $15. So from a total cost perspective, resource B is $50, including GHG. So under this example, what's notable is that resource B is the higher cost resource, both with and without GHG. So if you ignore GHG, resource B is $35 as opposed to resource A, only $30. If you also include GHG, resource B is $50, resource A is $40. So whether or not you include GHG, it's clear that resource B is more costly and that the ideal dispatch is to use resource A. The challenge is if you don't have an import hurdle rate and GHG costs in the external area are not considered, then external resource B appears less expensive and would be dispatched ahead of internal resource A, because resource B would only be dispatched according to its energy cost of $35, whereas resource A, because it's in the GHG jurisdiction and has to include its emissions in its costs, would be dispatched based on $40. So the hurdle rate prevents this outcome by assigning the unspecified rate on the import, avoiding the outcome in which resource B is inefficiently displacing resource A. And that is a similar concern that the deeming approach raises when resource B is the resource getting incrementally dispatched, but some other resource in the external area is the one being deemed. And that is why under the deeming approach, you can also get this outcome in which resource B gets dispatched ahead of resource A, even though it is less efficient to do that. And so the goal behind adding an unspecified hurdle rate is to say, in order for energy to be delivered into that zone, there will be an assumption about the marginal GHG cost of those imports to try to prevent that outcome from happening.
Hey, Jeff, this is Kevin. So I'm with you all the way up to the point where you said it's consistent with something that might happen under the deeming approach. So if I was resource B, I'm hoping that some other resource would get dispatched instead of me. And so is that
No, under the deeming approach, the algorithm can deem a resource that was already running and incrementally dispatch resource B at $35. So the algorithm might say that the most cost-effective solution is to incrementally dispatch resource B at $35 and deem a hydro resource that was already base scheduled to meet load in some other area outside of the GHG zone to satisfy the GHG obligation. And that will lead to resource B getting dispatched instead of resource A, even though that's not the right outcome when you're looking at the costs.
So resource B would just not be reflecting its greenhouse gas costs in its bid, which would be precarious for resource B, right? Because then they wouldn't get paid for their greenhouse gas costs if that case that you were describing did not occur.
No,
Because
that's not
left holding the bag, wouldn't they?
No, that's not quite right. What I'm saying, imagine resource B under the current deeming approach offers its energy at $35 and its GHG cost at $15. So it's bid in and offered to be deemed at a $15 rate. The issue is that the deeming algorithm is not limited to selecting resources that increase their production. So the algorithm can choose to dispatch resource B at a cost of $35 for the energy and deem a totally different resource that has a GHG cost of $0 and was already base scheduled. So the outcome of that is that the algorithm incrementally dispatched resource B, which is what's actually supporting the import, but deemed a different resource because there's no connection between those two choices in terms of which resources get incrementally dispatched and which get deemed. And that's what can lead to, under the deeming approach, a similar outcome to not having, to the example here in which there isn't a hurdle rate and you have resource B displacing resource A when it shouldn't be. Does that answer the question, Kevin?
I think I acknowledge the response. I'll let you keep going.
Okay. I see Stuart Kelly has a question too, so maybe we should take his question also.
Sure. Yeah, Stuart, go ahead.
Thanks, Jeff and Mary. I know that you folks have put in a lot of work to get this presentation to where it is, and I really appreciate it. And Jeff, completely take the point around resource B and I get the direction of the hurdle rate, because if we're not, because in your example, I'm looking at the GHG cost for both resources in this simplified example, and I'm assuming that resource A has a lower emitting factor than resource B, and that's basically why it has less of a GHG cost. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so you're effectively, I think, trying to get to, or maybe ask this question with a hurdle rate. You're not necessarily trying to get to the base cost dispatch per se. You're trying to get to some environmentally responsible dispatch in some ways by considering the GHG component. And I recognize the disconnect between the algorithm and how the resources get, potentially inked in your example. But I'm taking that a step further, and I'm trying to consider whether it's necessarily a hurdle rate, or is there maybe alternative to the hurdle rate, just to, within the market, potentially consider the GHG impact on every resource, irrespective of zone, but not settle it, because that would result in, for a non-GHG zone, potentially not necessarily least cost, but it would be an environmental responsive dispatch. And I wonder in some ways if you're getting to the same thing, but it would be a completely level playing field at that point. It wouldn't, non-GHG zones wouldn't be picking up the GHG costs and settlement potentially, but I'm just trying to tease out if that's even worth considering or not.
Thanks, Stuart. I think what I would say to that is, first of all, I understand the appeal from a dispatch point of view of saying, of incorporating GHG costs across the whole market footprint. And then once you've done that, you are sorting through the settlements to try to avoid impacting entities that aren't in the GHG jurisdiction. I think where the difference is between something like that versus this approach is really focused on the quantity of imports into the GHG zone. So from the perspective of resources that are being dispatched to meet load elsewhere, outside of the zone, it is not considering GHG costs in that outcome. It's really more to do with assumptions for imports into the jurisdictions, GHG jurisdiction itself. So from that perspective, I think this is less of a comprehensive impact to the market dispatch than actually considering GHG emissions globally across the whole market, because that would change the dispatch for meeting load outside of the GHG jurisdiction as well. So I think there's a more significant impact on the outcome. So I think that's kind of where I would draw the distinction in these two different approaches.
I agree, and I don't disagree with that at all, Jeff. I just wonder though, that, when you've got Washington, California, it works, but as the CES targets in the other states start to tighten, that's going to be problematic. And, in many respects at the start of this presentation, I just feel that there's a push for almost after the fact reporting being somewhat different to optimization in many respects, but I appreciate the feedback, so thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. We still have 4 more slides left, and they're pretty fairly substantial conceptually, so I encourage us to keep moving just so we can get through the presentation. Is that okay with you, Jeff and Mary?
Yes, sure.
Cool. Yeah, let's keep it moving, and we'll come back to questions.
Okay, next slide, please. This is wordy, a little bit wordy, but I'll try to go through it quickly just in the interest of time. So I think last time we received some questions around what the hurdle rate or what the default rate would be. So our starting point was that the assumption for the default emissions rate would first of all be predetermined for the market optimization, and that it would, a good starting assumption is the current unspecified rate, which is 0.428. This is something that was determined quite some time ago, but the idea is that it's reflecting the emissions of a marginal gas resource. And the dollars in terms of the hurdle rate would depend on what the allowance price was. So if you had a $30 allowance price and an assumption of a 0.428 emissions rate, that would get you a close to $13 hurdle rate. But that's just really a starting point for purposes of discussion. I think what the ideal objective would be is to try to find an unspecified rate that is based on a reasonable expectation of what the marginal resource in the non-GHG zone actually is, or is most likely to be. You know, this is, of course, we're using an unspecified rate because we don't know exactly necessarily which resource is marginal, but are there ways to improve upon a static assumption? Because I think there's sort of some competing objectives. If the emissions rate that you assume is too high, you may be losing optimization opportunities and ultimately dispatching either higher cost or higher emitting resources within the GHG zone when you would have been better off using more efficient resources somewhere else. So an overly high hurdle rate can have that challenge. But on the flip side, if it's too low, as we were just describing, it enables leakage because you can have less efficient and higher emitting resources externally being dispatched ahead of similar resources within the GHG zone. And so, you know, we think it'd be valuable to have a more detailed discussion about whether there'd be a means to develop a more dynamic hurdle rate that would better reflect system conditions. So, you know, as an example, varying that hurdle rate by hour of the day is one that's been raised in the past, where the marginal resource, for example, in the middle of the day when there's excess solar across the grid, might be different from the marginal resource in the peak net load hours. And so is there better methodologies that would be an improvement over the static assumption, but still serve the purpose of mitigating leakage and while avoiding an unnecessarily high hurdle rate when it's not necessary? So we think those would be really valuable additions to have. Next slide, please. Can we move forward a slide, please?
Hey, Brenda, we're not seeing the next slide. Would you mind moving on to slide 18, please?
All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and take over from Brenda. I'm not sure what happened there, so let's see if I can do that.
Yeah, otherwise I have the presentation up and I can, okay, yeah, thanks.
Is that good?
Okay. The other question that I think has been raised is supporting linkage or recognition of multiple programs. And we did talk about this last time as well. I think the first point to make is we think that this concept that we've been working through today does support having multiple separate GHG zones that are each applying GHG pricing in their areas. But I think much like some of the discussion in the previous meetings associated with the EIM approach, there are opportunities, I think, to improve upon that. As an example, under the zonal approach, if you had two GHG areas and they each decided to apply the full unspecified hurdle rate on all imports into their area, you could have some less than ideal outcomes because you would potentially have double charging associated with resources that are transferring from one GHG zone to the other, because you'd have GHG being paid in the one jurisdiction at the resource bus bar and then indirectly again through an import hurdle rate. So I think the point we wanted to make here was this is workable, but ideally regions that are applying GHG programs could choose to recognize that there is a program in another area and reduce the hurdle rate for the deliveries coming from that jurisdiction. So we just wanted to flag that as something that we think the market design should contemplate and incorporate, so that if you did have multiple GHG zones, they could conceivably recognize the application of a GHG price in determining what they think an appropriate hurdle rate would be coming into their area. So that's the last slide for me. I went through those two pretty quickly in the interest of time, but I'll turn it back to Mary maybe to cover the last couple of slides before we take further questions.
Thanks, Jeff. Can we move on to the next slide? Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about compliance and reporting. And again, kind of what we're trying to do here is, as much as possible, align the approach in the bilateral market. And also, I do want to kind of caveat, you know, this obviously is something that needs to be determined in concert with state regulators implementing the programs. So this is really conceptual and making suggestions on how this could work. I think for both of the specified source pathways into the GHG zone, you can maintain a consistent reporting for those resources to be reported as effectively specified imports. As we've talked about a little bit, they're not necessarily e-tagged, so there may be a different process for identifying the electricity importer, but conceptually be relatively straightforward in terms of identifying the entity who is responsible for that resource or that specified import. Again, kind of the validation and specific requirements would need further discussion and clarification, but I think relatively straightforward from a reporting perspective. The unspecified imports would be quantified based on that default unspecified emission factor that Jeff was just talking about. And a key difference here from how it works in the bilateral market is that individual importers are not identified through this mechanism. The hurdle rate is applied to all imports, and there's no identification of the electricity importer. You do have revenue generated through the hurdle rate for the purchase of allowances, again, theoretically the correct amount of allowances. So there's a determination needed regarding the redistribution of that revenue and assignment of responsibility for who is required to purchase and retire allowances. So you can go to the next slide. So we've put a couple options on the table here in terms of the redistribution of that revenue. But what I think it's really important to recognize is that you know, the hurdle approach is revenue neutral. So when the GHG zone is a net importer, the imports will reflect that unspecified rates. Generators in the non-GHG zone will receive a lower price, and load in the GHG zone will pay a higher price that reflects those GHG costs. So the market operator has collected surplus revenue, and the purpose of the revenue redistribution is only really to ensure the appropriate quantity of allowances are purchased and retired. So option one, redistribution to load within the GHG zone on an allocated basis. There could probably be a number of different ways to allocate it on a load ratio or based on the amount of energy purchased from the market. And there's some existing precedent for this concept in place right now through kind of the EIM purchaser in the current regulations. Again, I think this would be a relatively straightforward approach. And then option two, potentially even simpler, though maybe more challenging in some respects, CAISO or other central entity purchases and retires allowances. Again, kind of a mechanically simple approach, but I think potentially challenging from a with respect to the programmatic necessity of identifying an entity who is responsible for reporting those emissions and quantifying and reporting emissions. But I think an option nonetheless to consider. So that is the end of our presentation, Kevin. I think, have a little bit of time. Do we have the rest of the time here for questions?
Yeah, so we got about 10 more minutes for questions, and then I want to give Brian a chance to do a little brief recap and then talk about what we'll be discussing on Thursday. So we've got about 10 more minutes. So maybe I'll just start going through the questions. Thanks. Let's see. So I see Petr Rostanovic has his hand up. Petr, would you go ahead, please? We're hearing some noise.
Yeah, I think he has audio issues.
Yeah, it's a little scrambled. Maybe if you wouldn't mind trying to redial in, or yeah, it was sounding a little funky. So maybe I can ask a couple of questions while he's working on his audio issues. Michelle, if you wouldn't mind, can we just check in one more time to see if it's coming through? Unmute him.
Yeah,
and see
absolutely.
Is it better now?
Yeah. Yes, much better.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jeff, I'm assuming that hurdle rate in optimization is associated with ETSRs. Is that correct?
Would you introducing yourself and just saying which organization you're?
This is Petr from SGM. Jeff, did you hear my question?
Sorry, Petr. No, can you repeat it, please?
Yeah, I'm assuming that hurdle rate is associated with ETSRs crossing into GHG zone in the optimization. Is that correct, or you're thinking something else?
I think yes, although it might be helpful for me to understand the context, because I don't know if you mean something specific about ETSRs as opposed to another approach, but
No, I'm just thinking where hurdle rates needs to be, because in the current approach, GHG cost is associated with beads of units. So you have to plug somewhere a hurdle rate. So I'm assuming if you want to do what you're talking about, it needs to be somehow associated with ETSRs crossing into GHG zones. If that is the case, yes?
Yeah, yes, I just to clarify, what we were proposing is that the hurdle rate would be on the import quantity into the zone. Now, whether that's, that obviously is dependent upon how the zone is defined, but that's the concept. So I agree with you.
Yeah, it has to be on ETSRs to allow opt-out outside of GHG zones. So if you do that, would you have a discrimination against non-emitting resources outside of GHG zones? Because if order for them to import into GHG zones, they have to pass that hurdle rate. So there would be disadvantage to the non-emitting resources within GHG zones.
That was the purpose of the first part of the presentation, in which we were laying out avenues for resources to access the zone without facing the hurdle rate, either through updating the definition to the zone itself or enabling a resource-specific import that would not be subject to the hurdle rate. And so this application of the hurdle rate would only be to the remaining transfers that don't meet that criteria.
So there are three categories then, and you probably have to have three different paths. If you're talking about the other category, which are emitting resources out of GHG zones that have cost of GHG higher than your average rate, then you will make them more competitive when they are importing into GHG zones against emitting resources in GHG zones.
I think that's the concern without having a hurdle rate. I think if you put in a hurdle rate, let's just say that reflects the marginal an assumption about the marginal gas rate, it doesn't completely eliminate that concern to the extent that there was a resource that, coal or something that's even higher in terms of its emissions rate. But I think it addresses a significant amount of that concern if the imports are not accounting for GHG emissions at all.
So if you have example, let's say hurdle rate is $5 and coal is 15 outside and it's 10 inside some gas, and then that coal will be coming at 5 instead of 15, it will be more competitive than internal gas at 10. That's the concern.
Yes, I think that the unspecified hurdle rate, the objective is to minimize those outcomes by reflecting what the marginal resource is most likely to be at a given point in time, but it won't be perfect, and there could still be opportunities for certain resources that have an emissions rate higher than that unspecified rate to be imported into the zone. But relative to not taking that step and relative to the deeming approach that's currently in place, I think that it is a significant improvement.
Well, that's arguable. It's a very interesting idea, and it's questionable which one is better, especially after the latest fix that George made about that import constraint. So it's really, none of this is perfect. It has pros and cons. So it's going to be interesting to see which one is moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pat.
Thanks, Peter. So I recognize that we have a fair amount of open areas here, and we might see if anybody else has any questions. I'm not seeing any hands up. So what I will do is hold on to my questions and maybe give a little recap of what I think you guys discussed today and try to characterize what the open issues or some of, at least in my mind, are, and then move on to what we'll talk about on Thursday. But do you or Mary have any closing remarks that you want to give? Otherwise, I'll say thank you, and I'll probably say thank you more than once because this was a really big lift and very helpful in moving the ball forward in a number of different areas. So do you guys have anything you want to say other than?
I don't.
Thanks, Kevin.
I appreciate the time. Sorry, Mary. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Jeff. Go ahead, Jeff.
I was just saying that I don't have any further comments, so please go ahead.
I don't have any further comments either. I just appreciate, everybody's questions and consideration of this concept.
Yeah. Well, thank you too. This was really a great presentation today. So let me characterize what I think we've talked about today. So we did a little bit of a recap as to what the basic format of the unspecified / zonal approach is, talking about the hurdle rate, and then we put more specifics about potential pathways that might be used to enable source-specific serving of a greenhouse gas zone in a non-greenhouse gas zone. And there was 2 paths offered there, and these might be one or the other, or might be a combination of the 2. One was a longer term one where resources could determine that they want to be defined as being in the greenhouse gas zone. And that would be based on a longer term commitment to serve that greenhouse gas zone. What that long-term commitment might look like and how do we sort of define what we mean by that is something that we'll need to flesh out a little bit further. Path 2 is a shorter term one whereby the election could happen more frequently and would generally be focused around whether or not there's surplus supply in the non-greenhouse gas zone to serve the greenhouse gas zone. And then there might be a combination of those 2 that might work. Then we talked about leakage generally, and then secondary dispatch in particular, And a example was brought up as to how the zonal or unspecified approach addresses it in a differential fashion from the way that the resource-specific deeming approach does currently. Then we talked about a bit about how the hurdle rate might work. And one potential idea was that we would use an allowance price and the unspecified rate to come up with the hurdle rate. One open question in my mind is if there are multiple allowance prices in the greenhouse gas zone, say one for California and one for Washington, how we might calculate the hurdle rate under that circumstance. And I hope we can talk about that in a week's time. We did say that, though, that the 0.428 or another emissions rate would attempt to be a reasonable expectation of the marginal resource in the non-greenhouse gas zone. And we talked about some of the pros and cons of setting it too high or too low, and that there might be a balancing act that needs to occur with the rate that we use there. There was some discussion about support for program linkage and recognition that there will be effectively sort of two greenhouse gas zones, and some challenges of the greenhouse gas zones selling to each other, that it might result in double charging of emitting resources when they transact energy between each other. And the discussion of compliance and reporting was held, and there were sort of two potential pathways here: specified imports with validation requirements that might fit more into the existing model, and the unspecified imports that are based on the hurdle rate. Basically, once that hurdle rate is overcome and the energy is transacted across the boundary between the non-greenhouse gas zone and the greenhouse gas zone. What are some of the challenges here, in particular because the individual importers are not identified, and some potential approaches were raised on that. The first was that, you could consider redistributing, this is moving into the revenue component of it. But I do think that we will have some more discussion around how compliance and reporting will work under this. Turning to the settlements portion of it, though, there was the point raised that the hurdle approach might be revenue neutral, and that we'd need to figure out a way to make sure that the hurdle revenue is distributed appropriately. One way to do that might be distributing it based on the load in the greenhouse gas zone, or alternatively, that the ISO or a different central entity could purchase and retire the allowances. So we'll need to discuss a little bit more about how the settlement aspect of this approach works too. So we will hopefully discuss that as a group next Tuesday. So I encourage folks to really think about the topics that were raised today, because it won't just be up to Mary and Jeff to figure out how this works. I really want to sort of give everybody else a chance to weigh in on how they think it should work and really participate in the development of this policy. After all, that's sort of the spirit of this working group, is to vet these ideas and flesh them out. Turning to Thursday's meeting. So what I'd like to do on Thursday is perform an evaluation of the resource-specific approach, and that was the one that was raised by the ISO policy team last Thursday. And we have a list of design objectives posted on the working group website. And what I'd like to do is line up the resource-specific approach and compare it to those design objectives to see if we can characterize how well those design objectives are met by the approach. So we'll try to do that in isolation. We've tried this once before, but I think we've learned a lot more, and we have more of the details of that proposal posted. So if you wouldn't mind reviewing the design objectives that are posted on the website, we can then take those design objectives on Thursday and do the evaluation, and then turn back to this unspecified or zonal approach a week from today. So we're out of time here. Let me just say thank you to everybody, and thank you in particular to Jeff and Mary for raising this and putting in the work on this. And thanks Brenda and Michelle for helping getting this meeting going. So thanks guys.